Yes, I think we'll just let people in as they come in, because we're or maybe we can give it like 1 or 2 more minutes. But what do you say, Marjan? Shall we get started? Let's get started. And you know, it's a Sunday afternoon. People are just going to slowly come in. So, well, it's really a great pleasure for me to have Professor Austin O'Malley here with us. We were just talking about the fact that writing a book that gets into a top university press publishing series is really arduous, is a long journey. It takes a lot of stamina. And as you do it, you don't necessarily, do not get any any extra time, any free time from your other duties, teaching and mentoring and all of that. I've had the luck to be familiar with the manuscript from a long time ago, and really was very excited that we were paying more attention to ʿAttar. Of course, Rumi was getting its fair share of attention, or maybe sometimes a little even too much. But there wasn't that much attention to ʿAttar, where in fact, ʿAttar is the major, really that authority that Rumi looks up to, besides Sana'i. For everybody who knows Persian, in fact, he says, ዐتار روح بود و سنایی دو چشم او ما از پی سنایی و ዐتار آمدیم. So ዐتار was the spirit of this. And of course, Sana'i, with his attention to every aspect, every touchable, every palpable aspect of the journey, is the eye for him. So it's good that we're beginning to recognize the significance of ዐتار. And it was really good that a person was doing that who cares a lot about the details and the significance of textual tradition, the robust textual tradition that these works are based on. At the same time, Austin's work is actually establishing connection between speaking and sermons and teaching, rather, I should say, as well as the text. So it's in many ways, it is a very important step in the overall body of literature that brings us closer to ዐتار. And no doubt you know from the flyer, I'm talking about the Poetics of Spiritual Instruction, published by Edinburgh University Press, and I believe in 2023.
Yeah.
And, so in that sense, it's been out there, but we wanted to celebrate it, because good work needs to be celebrated. So close to maybe a year ago, we told Austin, well, you should come to Roshan, and being a Roshan professor yourself, should definitely honor us with speaking about this book. But I am going to ask my colleague, Dr. Marjan Mousavi, to actually do a little more proper introduction of Austin.
Absolutely. Thank you. Hello, all. I'm honored to read Dr. O'Malley's bio. Austin O'Malley received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 2017 and is the Roshan Institute Assistant Professor in Persian and Iranian Studies at the University of Arizona. A scholar of classical Persian literature with a special interest in performance, textuality, and reception, particularly in Sufi contexts, he published his first book on Farid ad-Din ዐتار with Edinburgh University Press in 2023. His work has also appeared in Encyclopedia Iranica, Iranian Studies, the Journal of Persian Studies, and Al-Usur al-Wusta, the Journal of Middle East Medievalists. He's now beginning a new monograph project on spurious, forged, and misattributed texts in the Persian literature tradition, which he will be researching as a Bahari visiting fellow in the Persian book arts at the Bodleian, if I'm pronouncing it
Bodleian, yes.
Bodleian Libraries at Oxford in spring 2025. Please join me in welcoming Dr. O'Malley. And Dr. O'Malley, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for that really kind introduction from both Professor Keshavarz and Professor Mousavi. And thanks, of course, for inviting me to speak here. It's really an honor and a pleasure. And so what I'm planning to do is just sort of give you, we're a small group, and I want it to be a sort of informal and sort of talkative kind of overview of the book and the kinds of things I'm trying to do with it. And then also I'm going to sort of delve into one chapter a little bit more in particular. But it's meant to sort of give you an overview of the kinds of things I'm interested in. And then, of course, if people have any questions or just want to discuss it in any way, criticisms, comments, whatever. I mean, I'm very open to that. So,
and Austin, if you interrupt, forgive my rude interruption. We are recording, so you will be eternalized on our website, and others will also hear this, which is great.
No, okay. And I've already had people who have requested the link from me.
Yes, there were people who couldn't be here, and okay.
So I'm going to share my screen with you. And so the title of the book and the title of the talk here is The Poetics of Spiritual Instruction, Farid ʿAttar and Persian Sufi Didacticism. And this word didacticism, I'm sure most of you know what this means, right? This means a kind of poetry that teaches or instructs. Some of you probably think about it a lot. Some of you maybe haven't thought of it since high school. This was like one of the theme words that we got on like a high school English literary terms quiz, I remember. But what this means is sort of educational poetry, right? Poetry that aims to teach. And I think that in a lot of ways we could say that all poetry is didactic in some way, right? In the sense that all poetry, I think, is trying to provoke something in its listeners or give them some sort of new kind of experience or new way of looking at things. But when I talk about didacticism here, I do mean it in a more sort of narrow sense. And that's that poetry that really sort of wears its educational or pedagogical aims or intentions on its sleeve quite explicitly. And this kind of poetry, at least in the Persian tradition, is often sort of dominated by a kind of hortatory mood or mode, imperative mood. Oftentimes it sort of proclaims quite explicitly that it wants to instruct. Lots of sort of direct address to addressees that the readers are sort of invited to inhabit. And it's a major component of the Persian literary tradition. And I think that, in general, didactic poetry doesn't really get much love in the most parts of the modern academy, and I would say sort of modern literary culture writ large. There still is plenty of didactic kind of literary cultural production, but most people think they don't like it very much or sort of dismiss it. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think especially in the sort of post-romantic and post-romantic period, there's not much patience for poetry that sort of explicitly instructs. I think there's an idea that didactic poetry sort of means exactly what it says. There's not much ambiguity in it, not much nuance. Yes. There's a lot of quotations from people like Shelley and about the sort of heresy of didacticism in Poe and how didacticism is his abhorrence. Of course, poets like Shelley are still sort of teaching something in their poetry, but they see it as a more kind of oblique sort of teaching. So there's a nice quotation from De Quincey about how poetry should teach, but as the stars teach and the oceans teach and the woods teach, right? It's sort of oblique and sort of by hieroglyphic suggestion. It's not something that's direct and sort of in your face with a direct imperative. And of course, this gets to the sort of what's now the old saw about, showing rather than telling. And sometimes didactic poetry seems to do a lot of telling and maybe not as much showing as we'd want it to. So these are all reasons I think it's sort of been maybe discounted in ways that I think are not really fair if we take it on its own terms. Also, I think in the modern period, certainly from the new critics onwards, there's an idea that, poets really don't have, and all authors don't really have authority over the meaning of what their poems or stories mean, right? This is called the intentional fallacy, right? That, we as scholars and readers make meaning out of things and the poet doesn't own it. And I think there's maybe a misapprehension that didactic poets are sort of trying to own their works in a way that others aren't. And we'll see this in the didactic Masnavi that I'm going to talk about here. Most people here are probably familiar with Rumi or ʿAttar. They have these narratives and these anecdotes, and then they give sort of explanations of the narratives or the anecdotes about what they mean and what their points are. And I think there's sometimes a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to that kind of movement, as maybe authors are trying to muscle into the space that we as sort of scholars and critics and readers ought to have, right? So I think there's some discomfort with that. So for all these reasons, I think didactic poetry hasn't really gotten its due. And in the Persian tradition, I mean, one way to see this is just there's, I've gone to a lot of dissertation defenses about sort of Rumi's narratives, and I've read, a number of books that tend to focus on the narratives, but, half of the poem is not narrative. It's these sorts of sermons that are intertwining with it. And I think those are not looked at nearly as much for all these reasons that I've just been mentioning. So one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is sort of think about didactic poetry, the kinds of relationships it constructs with its readers, and sort of the teaching activity that it's engaged in a way that maybe sort of pushes back against some of these assumptions or some of these stereotypes about didactic poetry. And the poet I do that with is Farid ʿAttar. And I'll talk a little bit more about him later. As Professor Keshavarz was mentioning, there's actually quite a number of sort of books coming out about him now, or there's a couple other things coming out about him now, but for a while he wasn't so researched, and really the major work was Helmut Ritter's The Ocean of the Soul, which is a really fabulous piece of scholarship in many ways. What Ritter does is he sort of takes the different anecdotes from ʿAttar and sort of categorizes them by theme, and sort of tries to show what sort of the principles of ʿAttar's sort of mysticism or psychology or theology are sort of by sort of distilling down these anecdotes to sort of major sorts of construct a worldview, basically, for ʿAttar. And that's, I think, sort of the approach people often take, sort of sets a paradigm for how ʿAttar and other didactic poets were approached, sort of trying to think about how can we sort of take these complicated stories and homilies and sort of extract a kind of system, right? A kind of sort of metaphysical system from it, or a kind of psychology from it, or a sort of worldview, right? And then articulate that in prose. And so people often, this is sort of, I think Ritter actually coined this phrase, and it's actually not a bad phrase in certain ways. I agree with it, but he calls ʿAttar's works a sort of encyclopedia of Sufism. And there's a way in which that's very apt. But sometimes I think people sort of think that's all it is. And they think it's sort of, it's a sort of treasury that has sort of different, they're just sort of interested in what is the sort of ideational content of it, right? What are the sorts of different propositions? What are the different teachings within it? And I'm trying to sort of move away from not talking just about sort of the teachings in isolation, but sort of the poem's teaching activity, right? How does it construct a relationship to its audiences? How does it imagine its audiences? What kind of work does it imagine itself doing on those audiences? To sort of recover, I think, sort of the sort of performativity of the didactic pedagogical relationship that's established here. And start seeing how actually readers are very much involved in meaning making in didactic poetry. And it's not just sort of this one-way street or just sort of a box with different kinds of metaphysical or psychological teachings within it, but this sort of back and forth that's establishing a kind of pedagogical relationship, which is definitely evoking sorts of pedagogical relationships that exist in sort of the social non-literary sphere as well. And I do that in different ways in the book. And I'll touch on some of them. I'm especially going to look at sort of narratology today and the frame tale structure, and how that is constructed in a way sort of to invite readers into the text, to inhabit it. Before we get to that, though, I just wanted to give a sort of taste of didacticism in the Persian literary tradition. And when I talk about didacticism, you know, it's not really a, I wouldn't mistake it for a sort of genre as how we use the word today. It's more of a, I like to call it a mode, right? It's something that crosses different forms, right? You can find it in rubai, you can find it in ghazal, you can find it in qasideh, you can find it in masnavi. It can interweave with other kinds of modes like the amatory mode or the sort of panegyric mode, right? You can find bits of hikmat or wisdom, you know, alongside praise. You can find the Shahnameh is full of moments of didacticism, right? Alongside descriptions and sort of epic narrative. Nizami is full of moments of didacticism. So, you know, when we talk about hikmat or pand or nasihat, these are things that it doesn't necessarily imply a particular poetic form. And also it doesn't mean that other things aren't present or it's not interwoven with other things. The sort of earliest bits of hikmat or wisdom that we have in Persian are from this sort of scattered corpus of very early wisdom verse from the 10th century. And there's many poets who are composing these kinds of verses. We don't really have many full poems at all from this period. What we have are sort of isolated, scattered verses that have been preserved in later anthologies or other later literary works, quoted in other later literary works, although presumably they would have been part of longer poems. But we just have these sorts of scattered verses, and they seem to, at least in the case of Abu Shakur Balkhi, they really have the feel of sort of proverbs, right? And because they've really just a couple lines are preserved, they probably function very much like proverbs, with people using these, reciting these in different contexts, right? To sort of add emphasis to a conversation or provide some advice to people or to think through problems in their own head. And these kinds of verses tend to provide sort of pragmatic teachings for how to sort of felicitously move through the world, right? Sort of practical ethics, if you will. So I'll just read a couple examples here. So we have, I have heard a thing is secure when it has many protectors, but when it comes to secrets, they are safest when they have but a single guard, right? شنیدم که چیزی بود استوار که او را نگهبان بود بی شمار مگر راز کانگاه پنهان بود که او را یکی تن نگهبان بود, right? So things are secure when they have lots of people around protecting them, except for, of course, secrets when you only want your own tongue to be there, and maybe not even that, right? Keep that tongue caged up behind the teeth, yeah. Or when the tree is small, the gardener can bend it any way he likes, but when it is grown, he cannot correct its crookedness, right? درختی که خردک بود باغبان بگرداند او را چو خواهد چنان چو گردد کلان باز نتواندش که از کجی و خم بگرداندش, right? So you know, it's a I really like these things, right? You know, it's taken from the natural world. This is, you know, the principle that, you know, you can stake out a young sapling and get it to grow straight or in a various form, if you like. This is something that's familiar to anyone who sort of worked in a garden or seen people working in the garden, right? And here it's being used as a kind of similitude, right? To presumably one might imagine this. You could imagine it being applied in different situations, right? Maybe to explain like why an old relative's behavior, can't really be, they're not going to change their ways, right? Or maybe why a young child needs to be punished in a particular way, or maybe encouraged in a particular way, right? You can imagine people using this in different ways, right? Much like. So this is sort of early hikmat, it's usually called in the anthologies. That's used as a sort of generic term if we understand genre in this sort of thematic transformal way. A bit later on, another important genre we have is the Sher Zoht, ascetic poetry, and Sher Vaz, homiletic poetry or sermon poetry. And Nasr Khosrow is a sort of one of the first poets we have who has a sort of real major divan that's extant in these genres. And of course, he also has panegyric and ekphrastic poetry. Again, these genres merge. But ascetic poetry is usually much like this sort of hikmat poetry, which it overlaps with, I think. It has a sort of pragmatic orientation, but it tends to be more sort of influenced by an Islamic ethos, often focused on the afterlife or the inevitability of death, right? Remember that you will die. Start thinking now about how you're preparing for death. Make sure you're turning to piety, right? And away from sin. And also these poems, we have much longer sort of poems in these genres than the very early scattered, hikmat verses that belong to someone like Abu Shakur Balkhi. So I have just this is a snippet of a very, very long qasideh from Nasr Khosrow, who, again, later commentators like Daulat Shah say that most of his poetry is in what they call zohd, asceticism, and vaz, or homily. So he says, listen to my fatherly advice, O son, the same advice that Noah gave to Shem. Avoid anyone who does not recognize the instability of the world and its blessings, and who, from his heart, cannot drive out the darkness with the light of religion and knowledge of God. Wash your hands of him and accept with silence. Give no answer to his questions, O son. And this kind of ascetic poetry, it's often described as a kind of sermon in verse. De Bruyne describes it this way and says, that the sort of speaker is sort of mounting a sort of imaginary pulpit, and sort of the audience, we're sort of invited to see ourselves as the listeners gathered at the speaker's feet. And I think that's apt. And Sher Vaz really means homiletic poetry, sermon poetry. But here we can also see how it's this sort of preacher audience relationship. Here it's also sort of merging with this sort of father-son kind of relationship, right? So Nasr Khosrow, not just Nasr Khosrow, lots of sort of didactic and ascetic poets use this mode of address, but it seems like every other line in Nasr Khosrow is "Ey Pisar," "Oh son," or "Oh boy," right? And this is sort of the kind of addressee, and it encodes a kind of subject position that readers are invited to inhabit, right? That they're there to sort of learn at his feet. They're sort of need instruction from him. And there's something that can be a sort of demeaning about this epithet, right? If you assume a sort of mature male readership, but also it shows a possibility of growth, right? That this is a boy or a son who can sort of grow up and learn the proper ways of the world from this paternalistic kind of a father figure that Nasr Khosrow is playing, and he sort of suggests that he's giving the same advice to this imaginary son that the reader is invited to identify with, that Noah gives to his son Shem. So this is being tied back to a sort of Abrahamic, a broader kind of Abrahamic prophetic paternal advice, right? And Nasser Khosrow sort of carrying on that tradition to his own imagined readers here. This kind of poetry is very important for what I want to talk about today, which is the didactic masnavi. I think most of you know what a masnavi is, right? This is a poem of rhyming couplets, so we can get much longer ones than monorhyme poems, where, you know, after 60 lines of a qasideh, you're going to start, even the best poets are going to start sort of reaching for rhymes, and things are going to be getting a little stretched and sort of recherché at that point. But with a masnavi, you can have 10,000 line poems. And because of the freedom, it's also much easier to write narrative, right? So these didactic masnavis and tend to be formed with sorts of you get narratives or little short anecdotes, usually, you know, a dozen lines maybe. And then after that, you'll get a little homily that looks a lot like this kind of sort of zohdiyat or hikmat verse, but also tends to sort of explain or interpret the anecdote that precedes it or follows it on some level frequently. And so the homilies sort of take the anecdotes and they sort of translate them into sort of the imperative mood, right? Telling readers, you know, do this or don't do that, or take this kind of lesson. And the anecdotes in turn, they sort of concretize the homilies, exemplify them, right? And help us sort of see the point playing out sort of in life, if you will. And so they have this rhythm, right? This sort of alternating rhythm. That's sort of this rhythm of anecdote and homily is sort of the fundamental rhythm of the didactic masnavi. And in ʿAttar's case, and I would say most writers of these kinds of poems, these anecdotes are taken from a huge variety of sources. They're quite omnivorous. They can sort of graze on all sorts of different sources of narrative culture, right? So some of them, we might say, and sort of, you know, that sort of religious secular divide isn't really an appropriate one for this period, but I'm just going to use it as a sort of heuristic now to make my point. You know, some of them are things that we might consider religious, right? Like stories of the prophets, stories of Prophet Muhammad, stories of Sufi saints, right? There's quite a lot of those, but there's also a whole lot of other kinds of narratives here that in the modern period we probably would consider secular, right? Things from, you know, talking animal fables, sort of from Khalil Dimna, stories of sort of stock characters like cobblers and grocers and unnamed princes, historical princes. Sultan Mahmud shows up a lot, Nizam al-Mulk, right? So a whole lot of different kinds of narratives. One can imagine he's taken from a lot of sources. And I'll give you an example here. This is one of the more famous sorts of anecdotes or similitudes that one finds in ʿAttar. And this is the story of the Qoknos. This is, you know, in modern Persian, I've noticed people often say Qaqnus or Qoknus, but in ʿAttar's text, it's Qoknos. And this is the story of a wondrous bird that lives in India, ʿAttar tells us. And it has a sort of perforated beak with multiple holes in it. And when it expels air, ʿAttar doesn't tell us this, but presumably it can sort of close certain holes, and it can make different notes coming out of the beak, as if it's sort of like a recorder or something. And it lives for 1,000 years. And there's only ever one of them in existence at any time. So I'd say, you know, this is quite a wondrous creature. And at the end of its 1,000-year lifespan, it goes and it gathers sticks and brush and piles it at its feet. So it's making a kind of nest, but this nest is actually a funeral pyre, because it then flaps its wings a little bit and it produces sparks. And this causes the brush gathered at its feet to ignite, and then it self-immolates. And as it does this, it plays this sort of mournful tune, sort of self-dirge or self-threnody from its beak. And this throws all the animals and birds and fish around it into a kind of ecstatic lamentation. that many of them actually die as well from the sort of effective power of it. And so then it burns, and when the embers die down, a little bache koknos, a little baby koknoslet, comes out of the embers. So this is, this seems to be, you can see sort of course, the sort of legends of the phoenix here, also ideas about the swan, and the swan song, or the song that the song swan, too many S's here, the song that the swan sings right before it dies. Before ʿAttar, there are some references to oknos-like animals in some of the scientific and philosophical literature, as an example of, and also the ajaib al-makhluqat, the sort of wonders of creation literature, is an example of sort of asexual animal reproduction. And also there's some interest in it because it's both a species, the individual and the species are totally coextensive, right? Because there's only one alive at any one time. So there's some sort of philosophical interest in this in terms of sort of categories. ʿAttar may have had access to those kinds of sources, or he may have just heard sort of oral legends about it. Throughout his version of the story, he says there's a lot of words like ajab and achib and torfe mori. So, I might see a kind of nod there to this sort of possible origin in the ajaib kind of literature, right? It's a sort of wondrous example of God's creative power. In his retelling of it, though, what I wanted to emphasize is that there's a whole bunch of sort of themes. I mean, it's quite a rich anecdote, right? I mean, in the birds, in the koknoses song, you can see maybe references to Sema, right, and its effective power. And actually, he does say that the science of music was invented when a philosopher observed the koknos. There's also this sort of theme of Indian exoticism running through it. It's found in India. I think that there's a sort of ambiguous line when the Bache Koknos emerges that suggests it might not just be a sort of new individual, but maybe the same individual again in a new reincarnated form, which seems like it could be kind of a oblique gesture towards sort of Hindu and Buddhist beliefs. And of course, with the practice of sati or widow self-immolation, that also seems to be something that could be sort of obliquely referenced here. So there's sort of themes of Indian exoticism. The theme ʿAttar sort of pulls out of it, though, in his homily is one really focused on sort of the inevitability and the sort of terror of death. Right, so he writes, and this is directly following it. In the end, death got its due. It came and scattered its gnosis, ashes on the wind, so that you might know that from death's claws none escapes alive. How long with these stratagems? In all the world there is no one without death, but behold this wonder, that none can bear it. Death is a harsh tyrant, and rebels must be brought to heel. Although much has befallen us, nothing is more difficult than this business of death. So we have all these sort of different sorts of thematic potential strands in the anecdote, but the sort of dominant one that he pulls out is this theme of sort of, he sort of turns the koknos into an emblem of sort of death's inevitability and its sort of terrifyingness, right? And if this koknos who lives 1,000 years is sort of mournfully preoccupied with its own death, how much more so should we be who only live, less than 10% of that, right? And what's so wonderful is not this magical bird with the perforated beak that sort of reproduces through self-immolation, but the fact that we have all of these stratagems for trying to not think about death and to sort of put it off, right? And sort of keep our happy ignorance. And that's sort of the true wonder here. So he sort of takes that anecdote and he puts a sort of moralizing point on it, right? And I think this is sort of one of the things sometimes modern readers have problems with, is that there's all these other sorts of untapped sort of themes in the anecdote, right? Like the power of Sima or the sort of Indian exoticism, but it's the sort of one strand that ʿAttar pulls out. But I don't think that means that, we can't explore those other themes or that readers wouldn't have. But it does mean that this one is sort of privileged by him, right? This is sort of where his sort of narrativizing voice wants to take us. And there's a sort of there's a book on Greek and Latin didacticism I quite like by Peter Tuhi, and he talks about a kind of similar sort of structure in the text he works on, and he calls it them narrative panels and then sort of explanatory sections. And he talks about how they have a tangential relationship, not in the sense that they're sort of unrelated, but in the sort of mathematical sense that there's a point, one point of contact, right? And it sort of pulls out one sort of theme. Another thing that sort of gives people trouble is that these anecdotes and homilies tend to seem sort of meandering and sometimes sort of digressive. It can be sort of difficult to determine a sort of pre-planned kind of tight logical structure according to which they've been put together. And there's been a lot of, there's been actually quite a lot of scholarship trying to, for instance, find sort of secret structures hidden in Rumi's Masnavi, for instance. And sometimes scholars will even sort of apologize for the digressiveness of this, sort of Nicholson does this and Ritter does this as well. And I think that, first of all, I haven't found any of this sort of analyses trying to find sort of very delicate, complicated pre-planned structures in these didactic Masnavis very persuasive. But I think the fact that scholars feel the need to apologize for its sort of alleged digressiveness and also feel the need to like spend a lot of effort to sort of try to uncover these sort of hidden, very careful structures says more about sort of where we're coming from now than sort of illuminating the context of these texts or how readers would have approached them. I mean, nobody seems to have, well, I'll get into that later, but if we have time. But what I wanted to say is that the way these anecdotes and homilies flow into another is really based not so much on sort of some sort of very abstract, general sort of book length structure that's pre-planned and advanced, but on sort of like linguistic or lexical or thematic or sort of imagistic kinds of keywords and index words. So I'll give you an example here. So this homily that ends the story of the Koknos, and ends with this line: although much has befallen us, nothing is more difficult than this business of death. And in the Persian, this is Garche mara kari besyar oftad, sakhtar az jumle in kar oftad. And this transitions into another anecdote, which is a bit funny. And that's something that's really not, I think, hasn't been, it needs to be underscored. It's like a lot of these anecdotes are actually pretty funny and humorous. And I think that's important to the work they do. So this next anecdote is sort of darkly humorous. And it's the story of, it's actually only 2 baits. So it's very, very short. It's not even a story. It's just, 1 or 2 narrative actions. And it's a fellow has died in maybe a village somewhere, and there's a funeral procession. And his son is understandably quite distraught, and he's walking behind the coffin, and he's sort of lamenting and, saying, this is so terrible. I've never lived a day so full of grief like this before. And there's a Sufi sort of standing along the way, perhaps where this procession is. And the Sufi jumps up and he says, he sort of rebukes the grieving son. And he says, he who was your father has never lived a day like this either. What has befallen the son is nothing. The difficult business has fallen on the father who has died, right? So, he's basically saying, you think you're sad, this guy now has to, go before the accounting angels and sort of see what he sowed in this world. That's what's really difficult, right? Like this, toughen up and get over it. So the Persian here is Sufi گفت آن که او بودت پدر هرگزش این روز هم نامد به سر نیست کاری کان پسر را افتاد کار بس مشکل پدر را افتاد. So it also deals with these themes of sort of the terror of death, the inevitability of death. In that sense, it makes sense to follow the prognos. But I think the reason that this particular anecdote was placed there, really it has to do with this this sort of like kar oftad, right? This kind of idiomatic use of this phrase to sort of happen or befall, kar oftad, right? And then again here we got, nis kari kan pesara oftad, kari bas mushkil pedara oftad, right? So it often tends to be these kinds of sort of idiomatic phrases or particular words, sort of theme words or index words or keywords that are responsible for sort of stringing together these kinds of anecdotes. And one could see that that particular phrase maybe brought this other anecdote with its sort of distinctive punchline to ʿAttar's mind. And that at times gives them sort of a semi-improvised feel. And I actually think that's not particularly surprising. I mean, one of the things I argue in the book, there'll be some, maybe I've already mentioned it once or twice, and I'll mention it again, but I won't get too into it. But I think that the didactic Masnavi in many ways is sort of evoking a kind of sermon or homiletic context. Not like a Friday khutbah, but a sort of more informal majlis-e vaz, sort of homiletic assembly, where people would get up and somebody might give a kind of homily or sermon, and it'd be studded oftentimes with narratives. The few examples we have, Rumi has some examples of these, are sort of studded with narratives, again, taken from all different sorts of sources. And those would often be sort of, semi-improvised and based on sort of audience response, right? And so I think it's quite natural that the didactic Masnavi also has that kind of feel, because it's evoking that kind of setting. Okay, so one of the things that sort of ʿAttar is most known for, and it sort of complicates this seemingly digressive or meandering structure of the Masnavi a bit, is that he puts these anecdotes and homilies that are characteristic of the didactic Masnavi into a frame tale structure. So that he's not sort of uttering them himself, or his persona is not uttering it himself, but they're placed in the mouths of characters in overarching frame tales. And he has 3 Masnavis that are structured in this way. And so this is sort of similar to Canterbury Tales or 1001 Nights, right? If you're familiar with those, as you likely are. So, the one that first really got me sort of interested in ʿAttar, and originally I was going to write a dissertation just on this, was the Musibat-name. And so the frame tale here sort of takes place in a chelle, or a 40-day Sufi retreat. This is a kind of ritual that was I think becoming increasingly popular in the 13th century when ʿAttar was writing, with the Kubravis and other orders gaining in popularity. And the disciple here would go into a sort of closed room, supposed to be very dark and small, and only leave to use the bathroom or go to Friday prayers. And would often be combined with other kinds of ascetic exercises, right? Like fasting, or reading the Quran multiple times through, or sleep deprivation. And this would produce oftentimes visions. And that's, I think also very understandable given the circumstances that one would be sort of putting their bodies through. And these visions, you were supposed to go and sort of tell your sheikh what you saw, and they would help you decipher it, and usually would say something about your spiritual state or psychological state. So the Musibat-name is basically an account of the sort of protagonist is called a salik, or a sort of wayfarer. They're time in a chalet, and they have 40 different visions, which they see in 40 different chapters. They see different sort of entities from all realms of creation, from the archangels down to the elements to the internal faculties. And then they go before their sheikh and they ask their sheikh to sort of tell them a bit about that particular entity they saw. And the sheikh talks about its sort of role in the cosmos and kind of symbolic associations, and then launches into sort of the anecdotes and homilies on those related themes. The Elohim, we get a conversation between a king or a caliph with his 6 sons, and they tell him that they all have these specific desires, like one wants to marry the fairy princess and one wants Solomon's ring. And in response to all of their requests, their father explains sort of the sort of spiritual analog or sort of spiritual meaning of those worldly desires, and encourages them to pursue it. And this takes the place again of sort of series of sort of anecdotes and homilies. Elohim is sort of interesting because the sons sort of respond and say, oh, but what about this? What about that? And that prompts, you know, a sort of substream of homilies and anecdotes. And then finally, most famously, of course, is the Mantagalter, the Conference of the Birds. And here we have the birds of the world gathering together. You can see them here. And saying that they need to find their king. And then the Hoopoe, the Hudhud, who's associated with Solomon, stands up and says, we already have a king. And that king is the Seymour. And we should go journey towards the Seymour to pay our respects. And the birds say, that sounds great in principle. But then when it comes time to set out, they start to voice sort of objections. And these objections are based on the sort of conventional poetic characteristics associated with each bird, right? So the duck says, you know, I like being clean and I need to keep doing ablutions in the water, right? So I can't go on the journey. Or the falcon says, I'm already on the forearm of a sultan, right, as a hunting bird. So, you know, why should I journey towards the Seymour? Or the nightingale, of course, has a beloved rose that it's reluctant to leave. So they give these kinds of excuses, and the Hoopoe meets them all with sort of rebukes and then anecdotes and homilies, right, that are tied to those particular concerns. And actually, at a certain point, he mounts a pulpit, actually, and gives a sort of sermon to the birds, again, with anecdotes and homilies, in a way that very much looks a lot like what these sorts of homiletic assemblies seem to have looked like, as according to writers like Ibn al-Jawzi, for instance. Yeah, it seems homiletic practice at the time, at least according to Ibn al-Jawzi, who was writing a bit before ʿAttar and in Baghdad, involved a lot of questions and answers. And I think that's really important when thinking about, you know, the sort of question and answer structure of the Conference of the Birds. So eventually they do set out and they travel over through these 7 valleys, right, which represent sort of mystical stations. Many birds die along the way, and only 30 make it. And then they see the Seymour, and they see themselves in the Seymour, and the Seymour in themselves. And so this, of course, is a sort of dissolution of identities at the point of Fana. And here we have the pun, of course, of Seymour and Seymour, which sounds like 30 birds. So, you know, it's quite a, you know, it sounds like quite an complicated narrative, as I just summarized it there. But, you know, one important thing to note is that that's really just sort of like the frame tale is maybe sort of the top 10% of the narrative, right? The real meat of the poem are these anecdotes and homilies, and that's probably 90% of its total length. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. So, you know, the sort of frame tale structure was something that I got very, very interested in very early on. And people will often say that, you know, the frame tale is a way to sort of make this mass of anecdotes from all different kinds of sources more coherent and arrange them into a text. And I think that's true. But there's also other things going on here. So, one thing that it does is sort of on the level of the frame tail, we have the hoopoe sort of addressing these birds. We also get to see the birds' reactions, right? And we also get to sort of learn about the hoopoe's stance on the pulpit. We get to hear the birds asking questions, right? And responding to the hoopoe. So it allows ʿAttar to sort of take the dialogical component of a sort of oral sermon and sort of try to reduplicate it within a text, right? In a way that's sort of hard to do if you're just doing a sort of conventional didactic masnavi without a frame tail, right? And you just have the poetic persona sort of addressing a sort of addressee who's just off stage, right? Here we actually get to see their reactions as sort of embodied beings, and I think that's quite important. The other thing that I noticed about this structure is that, we get these sort of embedded paranetic didactic speech acts at each level, right? So here I said on the level, the text, sort of in narratological terminology, we might call this the extra-diegetic level. We have ʿAttar's persona, sort of haranguing, technically I would say addressees, but readers are sort of invited to inhabit those addressees, right? And this is what we get in the introduction and the conclusion at various points in the poem, where ʿAttar sort of seems to turn towards his sort of virtual readers or addressees and sort of oftentimes sort of instruct them directly, often with admonishment and exhortation, right? Then on the level of the frame tail, we get the hoopoe doing very much the same thing with the birds, right? Although, as I already mentioned, here we get to see the bird's reaction, right? Which is important. We see that his harangues work, and he's actually able to motivate them to sort of get to see more. And this is very much in line with the conventions of popular preaching. And then within the content of the hoopoe's sermons, the anecdotes usually have sort of teacher figures and student figures. And they usually end with the teacher figure giving some sort of oral instruction to the student figure. We don't usually know if it works or it doesn't, but it ends with some sort of paranetic sort of speech act, right? Attempting to guide or reform or critique or rebuke some sort of student figure. And so these, the relation between these teacher figures and student figures can be, it's not necessarily the same as the hoopoe and the birds. I'll give you some examples in a moment, but it's the same sort of general idea of a sort of spiritual authority, sort of speaking and providing oral instruction. That, I think, we see that sort of fundamental structure being repeated and sort of in different kinds of variations and permutations throughout much of the poem. So I can give you an example here. This is a nice anecdote. There's a king who builds this palace, and he summons all of his wise men and boon companions and basically his yes men. And he puts them on thrones and he gives them a bunch of gold. And he says, "Have you ever seen such a lovely palace?" And predictably enough, they'll say, "No, this is fabulous. You've made the most beautiful palace ever." But of course, there's a dervish in the in the audience somewhere, and the dervish jumps up and says, "Oh, there's one major flaw." And the king says, "What is that flaw? Why are you starting?" He actually says, "Why are you stirring up such fitna?" And you can see the political implications of this criticism there. And the dervish says, "Well, there's a crack in the wall." And the king says, "What crack?" And the dervish says, "That's the crack that's open for Ezrail, the angel of death, who's going to come and get you, and you should spend less time sort of spurring on this mount of pride, and self-contentment, and think about death that's coming." So, we can see that the dervish is a kind of teacher figure who's sort of rebuking this addressee, right? And again, that's very different than the hoopoe and the birds. I mean, we don't know what happens to that dervish, right? Maybe it doesn't end too well for him, whereas the birds accept the hoopoe's authority, at least in principle. But we still get this, I think it's important to see, we get these nested speech acts here, right? And in a way, I mean, the hoopoe really becomes a sort of avatar for ʿAttar's own persona in many ways. And the birds become a kind of avatar for sort of or subject position for ʿAttar's readers, right? We're sort of invited to inhabit this position, to imagine ourselves alongside these birds being sort of harangued and admonished and exhorted, and like them, hopefully, sort of being able to make the way towards the Seymour thereby. And because we have these sorts of repeated speech acts, didactic speech acts at each level, there's a way in which these levels very easily sort of merge or converge. And it's sometimes tough to figure out the lines between them. So I'll give you an example here. This is from, it's a little anecdote. Maybe anecdote isn't even the right word. It's a sort of just a discussion. But the characters here are Rabi'a, a famous mystic, female mystic from early Islam, and Hassan al-Basri. And they're often paired together in the hagiographical literature as a sort of contrasting odd couple. So Rabi'a is said to be sort of unlettered and unschooled, but to have this very intuitive connection to God, whereas Hassan al-Basri is sort of one of the leading intellectuals of the time. And generally, Rabi'a ends up besting Hassan al-Basri somehow in these anecdotes. You know, ʿAttar has a lot of them, especially in his Tazkirat al-Awliya, and he'll have sort of Hassan al-Basri will like throw his prayer mat on the Tigris and it'll float there, and he'll go and do some rakat of prayer there. And then I'll say, can you do this, Rabi'a? And then she'll throw her prayer mat and it'll levitate in the air. And we'll say, I can do better than that. You know, I can pray while levitating. But this is all just showing off, and we shouldn't really be doing it anyway. So she usually ends up besting him in certain ways. So in this particular anecdote, Hassan al-Basri asks her to share sort of one of her spiritual insights that she hasn't heard anywhere or read anywhere, right? That she's just sort of intuited herself. And she says, "Oh, Sheikh of the age, I had once woven a few strands of rope. I took them and sold them and was glad of heart. 2 coins of silver were my profit, but I wouldn't take both in one hand at one time. I took this one in this hand and that one in that, because I was terrified that if they joined forces, they would waylay me on the path and I wouldn't be able to resist. The worldly man puts his heart and soul in blood and places 100,000 other snares so that he can obtain even a bit of unlawful gold. Once he's obtained it and dies, that's it. For his heir, that gold will be lawful, but he will be mired in the consequences of sin. O you who have sold the Seymour for gold, you've lit your heart like a candle in love of gold. Since there is no room in this way for a single hair, no one can have both a store of treasure and a sallow face." So, you know, this is an example of her extreme scrupulousness. You know, she won't hold 2 coins in one hand. And what I want to draw your attention to, though, is that at some point, you know, she's giving this oral, not really, she's not rebuking Hassan al-Basri here, but sharing this sort of insight she has with him, right? Verbally. But at some point, the speaker changes, right? Because down here we have, "Oh, you who have sold the Seymour for gold." And that, you know, doesn't sound like something Rabi'a would be saying to Hassan al-Basri. It sounds like something the Hoopoe would be saying to the birds, right? But it's not exactly clear where that switch happens. Sort of her speech sort of melds into the Hoopoe's rebuke of the birds. And, you know, there's no quotation marks in these texts in pre-modern sort of Persian or Arabic or European languages for that matter. So we don't, you know, ʿAttar is not forced to sort of say exactly where this switch occurs, but modern editors actually do often put these in. And that's an editorial intervention, right? So Shafi Kadkani, whose edition most people rely on these days, I did for my book. In some ways, it's sort of a popular edition, and he wants to make it easier to read. So he does put these quotation marks, and he puts, he says that Rabi'a stops talking here, right? And that sort of makes sense, right? I mean, she's using the first person pronoun I through here, reflecting on her experience. And then after this, the worldly man puts his heart and soul in blood. We get to sort of more generalizing sententia, you know, a sort of third person kind of more universalizing things. So, I mean, that makes sense to me, but that you could put it somewhere else, right? You could say this is a kind of little impromptu sermon she's giving based on her own experiences. And, you know, "Oh, you who've sold the Seymour for gold," these kinds of vocatives also often will signify a switch in speaker, right? But I'm not trying to say that he's wrong where he put it. I think it makes sense. But what I'm trying to say is the only reason we have to answer the question definitively is because of the sort of convention of using grammatical markings. And I don't think ʿAttar and his readers would have actually asked the question, or not asked it so carefully. Actually, on the contrary, I think one of the things they'd be interested in is sort of how this, you know, Rabi'a's speech can sort of meld into that of the Hoopoes, because they're both occupying this sort of same position in this sort of rhetorical axis, right, of sort of teacher figure instructing or speaking with a student figure. And so there's a way in which their voice merges, right? And we also see that, you know, the Hopo's voice also often merges with ʿAttar's voice. So when the birds come to each valley, the Hopo gives a little sermon on it. And when they come to the Valley of Tawheed, he gives a sort of sermon on Tawheed or oneness and its various meanings. And then at a point, we get this line, how much of, and then he digresses, he talks about sort of how vices within the soul are like snakes and scorpions. And then we get how much of this metaphorical language, or ʿAttar, come back to the secrets of oneness. So, you know, if someone is really expecting these narrative levels to be strictly marked, you'd say, wait a second, wasn't the Hopo talking, not ʿAttar? But again, I think that their voices sort of very easily merge, right? Because they're both occupying the same kind of position in on this rhetorical axis. And I think that's actually really important for the poem, because again, the Hopo becomes a kind of alter ego or a kind of avatar for ʿAttar. And the Hopo's relationship with the birds is a way that he can sort of construct a kind of ideal relationship he wants to have with his own readers. So I sort of went down a rabbit hole of narratology, I think, at some point when I was trying to write this dissertation with, you know, Gerard Jeanette and Wayne Booth, and they're like, you know, you sort of needed to like make these massive trees of different varieties of all sorts of ways in which discourse is embedded in narrative levels. And in some ways it was productive, some ways not. But the sort of figure that most represents this is something they call metalepsis. And this is sort of it's described as like the intrusion or transgression of one narrative level on another. And it's often described as, in those terms, as, yeah, sort of a violent penetration or transgression, and it's said to be sort of vertigo-inducing and paradoxical and defamiliarizing, maybe underscores the fictionality of the narrative. And of course, the narratologists are all looking at novels and modern writing and postmodern writing. And I just want to emphasize here that I don't think there's anything really sort of transgressive or disconcerting about these meldings, right? And it's actually not defamiliarizing or underscoring the fictionality of the narrative. On the contrary, I think we're sort of being invited into it, right? We're seeing how like the Hopo's harangues of the birds are becoming a sort of model, extension of ʿAttar's own harangue of his own readers, right? So the effect is very different than what's described in the narratological literature. Okay, so I want to end by looking at one last sort of anecdote that really nicely exemplifies this. And this is the last anecdote before the birds reach the Seymour. And it's an anecdote about Joseph and his brothers. And it's unusual for a few reasons. So the birds, they arrive at the court of the Seymour, sort of knock on the door, and the Seymour's chamberlain appears, and they sort of, paraphrasing here, obviously, they're like, we've traveled so long to see the Seymour, and the chamberlain is like, the Seymour has no need of you. Like, what does he care about you all? Khuda fez shoma. And so the birds are very sad about this, but they decide they're going to keep loving the Seymour, and just as sort of, Majnun loves Layli despite her rebukes and actually welcomes the rebuke, right? And then once they realize that, they have to sort of freely give their love to the Seymour without any expectation of return, and the Seymour has no obligation to admit them, then the chamberlain returns, and he hands them a scrap of paper. And he says, read this scrap of paper. And that scrap of paper has the story of Joseph's brothers written on it. And so it's already being marked as sort of strange and significant in a few ways, right? This is structurally significant location in the poem. This is right before the birds meet the Seymour. ʿAttar tells us that the story of Joseph's brothers will elucidate the spiritual state of the birds as Rah-e-Misal, through the way of allegory, right? This is there's only 2 points in the poem where he uses that kind of language. This is one of them. The birds are reading it, right? They've, up until now, all these anecdotes have been narrated to them by the Hupo, right? Or narrated by ʿAttar's persona to his readers directly. But this is the first time they read anything. And the story of Joseph's brothers also includes an act of reading. So we get these nested acts of reading, right? The birds are reading a manuscript about Joseph's brothers who are going to read a receipt. I'll tell you the story in just a second. And of course, we all are reading this narrative of the birds reading the manuscript of Joseph's brothers reading. So the narrative is that in this version, when Joseph is sold into slavery, his brothers apparently sell him very cheaply. And the guy who purchases him is sort of worried that, you know, they'll say the sale was illegitimate somehow, which of course it was. But so he demands a receipt from them, and they write a receipt, and they give it to Joseph's purchaser. And then when Joseph is brought to Egypt, somehow the receipt falls into his hands, and then he of course becomes in this version the Padishah Misr, the sort of king of Egypt. And then of course famine strikes Canaan. So the brothers come to Egypt and they, as suppliants, and they visit Joseph, who is now king. They don't recognize him, and they say, "Can we please have some bread? You know, things are so bad." And Joseph says, "Sure, but you know, I have this manuscript and it's in Hebrew. No one can read it. Would you be able to read it for me?" And they say, "Sure, we'd be happy to." And of course, it's brought out, and they see it, and you know, they know what it is immediately, and they recognize Joseph, and they recognize their own sinfulness, and they sort of fall quiet in shame and terror. So the Joseph story, of course, is very much associated with sort of interpretation, right? Joseph is the dream interpreter par excellence. In Abrahamic myth, Surat Yusuf ends with a call to sort of take this as an ibra, right? Ibrat, a kind of lesson for those who can see. And of course, within the Quran, it's really presented as sort of evidence of sort of God's hand, sort of guiding human affairs to happy outcomes. In Sufi contexts, there's often a more allegorizing, more internalizing, psychological kind of interpretation. Joseph himself becomes a sort of symbol for the soul, not the nafs, but the ruh, the sort of part of the soul that participates somehow in the angelic realm or the divine realm even, right, or the celestial realm, and which we've sort of cut ourselves off from. That's how ʿAttar talks about it, at least. And going along the Sufi ways in an attempt to sort of, through ascetic exercise, to sort of reconnect to this part of the soul that participates in God. And the birds themselves show what this kind of allegorizing interpretation would look like, right? So this is what ʿAttar tells us. When those 30 miserable birds looked into the writing of that credible manuscript, right? This is the scrap of paper that has the story on it. Whatever they had done, all of that was inscribed there until the end. This seems to be a reference to sort of their sort of sinful activity and sort of separation from God. It was all them, and here was the difficulty. When those captives looked closely, they saw they had gone their own way, gone and made their own way, burned their Joseph souls into debasement, and on top of that, sold him, right? So they're sort of estranged from the Simor by virtue of their own sinfulness and really their own ontological existence in some ways, I think. And reading the story of Joseph's brothers, reading the manuscript and realizing that they've sold Joseph into slavery helps make that clear to them, right? And it's not just that they interpreted the story allegorically, but they sort of redouble the events of that narrative on their own lives, right? So Joseph's brothers, of course, come to the court of Joseph. They read a receipt. They recognize their own sinfulness, right? And that's what we have happening on the frame tale level, right? The birds are coming to the court of the Simor. They are reading this manuscript, right, that has this story, right, and that helps them recognize their own sort of estrangement from the Simor and how it's sort of from their own, it's on them, so to speak, right? And the story, the anecdote ends there, but you know, people who are familiar with scripture would know, of course, that ultimately this leads to reconciliation, right? So we have this sort of act of reading and then recognition and then reconciliation. Right? And that's exactly what happens with the birds, right? So after they they read it and they realize what's happened. Whoa. It says, once again, they became fresh servants of God. Again, they were bewildered, but in a different way. All that they had previously done or not done was erased and purified from their breasts. The light of proximity shone from ahead. All of their souls were dazzled by that beam. And then they're granted admittance to the court, and they see themselves in the Simorgh and the Simorgh in themselves, and we have the Simorgh pun, right? So they're reunited with the Simorgh, just as Joseph's brothers are. This is not a familial kind of relationship, but a sort of ontological one of participation in the divine. And I think that this, can't help but bring to mind, of course, these nested acts of reading, sort of the ʿAttar's own audience, their own act of reading of the Conference of the Birds, right? As they read this story of the birds reading a manuscript, of Joseph's brothers reading a receipt, right, and being reconciled thereby. And there's this promise that this pattern of sort of reading and recognition and reconciliation will sort of carry upstream to the readers themselves. And again, this is something that ʿAttar himself suggests, right? So he sort of turns to his readers at this point and he says, don't you know, you worthless beggar, that you sell a Joseph with every breath? When your Joseph becomes king, he will stand at the head of the court. In the end, hungry and begging, naked will you go before him. Since your affair will be illuminated by him, why did you have to sell him so lightly, right? So the readers are standing in the same kind of position vis-a-vis God as the birds are to the Simorgh and Joseph's brothers to Joseph. So
yes.
And the same kind of promise of reconciliation is being held out, through the reading of the Conference of the Birds. This is the kind of thing I'm sort of interested in doing in the book. This is just one example. I'm interested in thinking about how can we think about the text itself, sort of acting on its readers. How does it sort of obliquely suggest that action, right? Because we don't really have accounts of people reading the Conference of the Birds in the 13th century, right? We don't. I used to think that was too bad, but actually after reading the book, I think it's much more interesting to look at the text itself and see how it might obliquely be sort of theorizing its own power over its readers.
Yes.
Yes,
if you forgive me coming into your conversation, I think you're touching on a very important point here that, sometimes people say, and by the way, okay, I won't talk much because I want to see if people have questions, but often people say Persian literature is so huge, it is so wonderful, it has blah, blah, but unfortunately there were no critics, writing and saying things and criticizing, but well, a lot of it comes within the literature itself, as you say.
Yeah. And it's more, for me, it's more interesting to do it that way anyways, than just someone saying, this is what I think.
Absolutely. Yes.
So this is, this is one chapter. This is sort of the 5th chapter that I just shared with you here. And then I have other chapters where I'll look at sort of the metaphors ʿAttar uses. So the metaphor of medicine is very important to him, and speech is a kind of medicine. And I think through the implications of that, or I look at the more on allegory with the Mosi Batname and connections between allegory and vision and sort of assent and reading a frame tale. Or memorizing quatrains. So I do it in a lot of different ways, but what sort of binds it all together is an interest in sort of thinking about how these didactic texts sort of engage readers in a meaningful way, and how reading can become a kind of spiritual exercise, right? So it's not just sort of trying to, these texts are doing more than just sort of collecting together principles, sort of cliched principles of the good life or the religious life, right? And I think most readers would have been familiar with ʿAttar's teachings, but instead thinking about the text as a kind of, a kind of teacher, right? That sort of acts on the person and shapes the person, and you can shape yourself actually through reading them. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. آسین جان خیلی عالی، فوق‌العاده. از جزئیاتی که در سخنت واقعا برای ما بیان کردی، از پیچیدگی این تکست و زیبایی‌هاش و ارتباط اجزا با هم. I'm going to switch back to English because I know that we have audience who may not be speaking necessarily Persian. So I think we can open the floor to any questions anyone may have, either about the process of narratology, or this particular text, or at the ʿAttar's role, anything related to this whole rich presentation that Austin just left for us to, I think about for a while. I see already Ahmed's hand up, so please ask your question.
Yes, well, thank you, Austin, for this very thought-provoking and rich talk. It makes you. I have several things to say, but I just want to tie what came to mind as you were talking about the Joseph's brothers reading the receipt, and tie that to my comment, which is that, of course, the audience and whatever the audience is also contributing to this reading, sometimes we can capture, because ʿAttar actually captures it in some form or another himself. But it made me think of the Kiram and Katibin, the two angels who are, of course, recording all our deeds, and which will then be made available at the day of judgment. And then, of course, you will know how cheaply you had sold your soul, right? So there is that kind of an echo, of course, in the minds of the readers, which it was very nice that came at the end, because earlier on, when you were talking about the anecdotes and how, for instance, and you shared with us a couple anecdotes and how rich they were, like that of the Koknus, and how ʿAttar could have actually taken many of the different strands that run through that anecdote and run with it, right? But he chose only one. What made me think at that point, that actually there is another thing that we have difficulty capturing, which is that to the extent that we can assume some familiarity on the part of the audience with these anecdotes, or at least some of them, right? Then the authors, in this case, the ʿAttar's interpretations might also be very interesting to them, in the sense that he may, for instance, go out on a limb, or he might be very creative in his particular interpretation, and that introduces yet another playful at times element, perhaps, and creative element into the equation, which made me think that, okay, at times we can capture some of this, but at other times it's there in the background, so to speak, and we might possibly. Anyway, long story short, I just wanted to make that connection, that there is another dimension, as you pointed out later on. But I love the way you capture the nested speech act, through the nested speech acts, the way in which the didactic Masnavi, for instance, actually is able to relay to us the multivocal, and at times also, we have Marjan here, dramatic. It's almost like capturing drama,
yes,
and conveying to us in a different way. And that, I think, is a very good way of thinking about possibly the richness of these works, that the different levels of which your approach so nicely brings out. But let me end by saying that this is, so for instance, in contrast to let's say hagiography or malfuzat literature, where people just simply sit down and write the words of the sheikh, right? And to the extent the sheikh's own words are a bit like ʿAttar's, and they have nested speech acts, there is some similarity, but it doesn't go all the way. I'm thinking of malfuzat specifically, or perhaps even fihi mafi in a way. Whereas the didactic Masnavi enables the authors perhaps to introduce this this complexity. How would you react to that?
Yeah, I think that's, you know, the frame tale is, it's such a simple structure, but it's so difficult to sort of put your finger on how to even think about it, right? You know, I mean, because it's not, so the Malfuzat, I mean, and of course, people can argue and do argue about, you know, how accurate is it? Is it some, you know, is it a later reconstruction that's supposed to look like speech, or is it there? But in either way, it presents itself as
basically
a kind of transcription, or like a simplified transcription, right? But you know, the frame tale is not that at all. It's like you know, I don't think we should think about it as a novel. Like, this is exactly what the Hoopoe said, you know. And of course, ʿAttar's voice is throughout. You know, are we supposed to think of the Hoopoe? Is the Hoopoe speaking in Ramal and, you know, rhyming Masnavi, right? Like, the ʿAttar's voice is there throughout the whole thing, but somehow it's been, it's sort of merging, right? It's, you know, we're supposed to think about it as if it's something else, as if this text we're reading as if it were a oral sermon, but we don't lose sight of the fact it's a text at the same time. I mean, I've spent a lot of time trying to sort of think about exactly what the frame tale is and how it fits into sort of reported speech versus direct speech. And I don't think you can really I satisfactorily do it. You know, it's kind of its own thing, and it's an invitation to see the text as if it's some kind of performance that it is not. That, you know, that's sort of the best I can come up with.
Maybe this is one of those stars that Horatio, Hamlet says to Horatio that there are more in heaven and earth that fit in his philosophy. Maybe it is a good thing that, you know, I'm always, when I reach these, where there is no answer, you know, the kind of, or multiple answers. And my reaction to that always is, that's wonderful, because you do not put the full stop there. There is no ending to the conversation, to the give and take, it's kind of ongoing, and you know, for new generations and experiences. So I have a question which is very different, so I'm going to see if anybody else wants to follow up still on the text and issues related to speech.
Yeah, yes, I have a comment and also maybe a question. I just wanted to say that it's fascinating, the parallels that I actually, I was listening to when you were talking about the influence of hikmats, you know, in didacticism, and in studying the traditional performances, you know, Persian traditional performances, we always talk about, for instance, the influence of hikmat daridan parde pendar or Jamiyat Yaran, which all of them ask the performers and, you know, and theater makers to create an anti-illusionist, you know, representation or presentation of life on a stage. And this links well to, you know, the sort of didacticism that the theater makers and performers have in mind. So I just wanted to say that these parallels were very interesting. When we see, for instance, in traditional performances like in Ruhozi and in Taziye passion plays, that exists, and it is always so well intertwined with the aesthetic choices that the performers have. So we cannot really, as you said, you know, separate that purpose of, you know, teaching from the aesthetic and directorial choices that the artists have. So that was a comment, and I just wanted to say that it's very interesting, the parallels that we see in poetry and in traditional performances. The other thing that I've been also thinking a lot about framing, you know, in traditional and also in modern style, like Western style theater in Iran. It has the element of self-referentiality and self-reflexivity when we see that the play starts with, you know, a frame. And when we have play within the play, you know, so we have audience on a stage and, you know, they are being watched, but also they're watching another performance. So this definitely adds layers, as you said, it shows how rich the text is. But my question is that, maybe you talked about it and I missed it. How can we relate this self-reflexivity in ʿAttar that he has about his own, for instance, artistic vision, his creative vision, to the sort of didacticism that he has in his mind, because he's also self-reflecting, the process of writing. I mean, this is why my understanding, I don't know if it is true or not.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I think he's trying to do, so I think that there's a couple of things. I mean, part of, and I sort of briefly alluded to it, but these sorts of majalese vaz or mau'ize, right? These sorts of homiletic assemblies were very much like dialogical kinds of things, right? With performance interaction. So, and this is most of this I get from Ibn al-Jawzi, right? He's writing in Baghdad, he's not writing in Nishapur, and he's writing a bit earlier, but I think it's applicable. And there are accounts actually of some sermons in Khorasan that they have the same kind of character. But there's a very interesting thing that Ibn Jubair, the famous traveler, he sees Ibn al-Jawzi give 3 sermons in Baghdad. And he says most of his time is spent answering audience questions of people that ask him questions directly, or they pass notes to him in very large assemblies, and he'll read them and answer the questions. And I was really struck by that, right? The sort of dialogical character of the sermon. And I think it also, because I'm sort of quite insistent that the Conference of the Birds, the hopo, should be seen as a sort of popular preacher who's really delivering a sermon. But it's one of these sort of dialogical sermons that would have been practiced at the time. And I think also ʿAttar, ʿAttar, one of the things I talk about is I think he's very interested in sort of text and textualization. I mean, he's one of the first, he's the first poet we have who creates his own collection of quatrains, right? And thematically curates it thoroughly. So he's interested in sort of putting things down and writing and transmitting them. But of course, when you put something down in writing and transmit it for future generations, it's a different kind of communication than like an oral communication, right? Like an author can't respond to questions that someone has about their masnavi. Right? You can if they're your friend and they send you a letter or something. I think that actually happened quite a lot.
It happened a lot, yeah.
Were shaped by those who were, their disciples or their friends, right? But in terms of like, if this is going to be like Yadigar for me in the future generation, then there's a sort of distance. And so I think he was interested in sort of capturing that sort of dialogical element of like an oral speech, but trying to do it in text, right? And I mean, of course, you really can't, but you can. I think part of what the frame tale is doing, right, is an attempt to sort of capture that feel, right? To sort of invite readers into the like flock of birds, where we're sort of asking questions of ʿAttar, to sort of duplicate that sort of the dialogical characteristic of oral speech, but in writing. And partly, I mean, another way to see it is sort of as a tool of sort of authorial control too, right? To sort of show us how to react, right? And they demonstrate the power of his own speech. They make it to the Simor, or 30 of them do. It's a dangerous way.
Some do.
Yes, right? But we see the effectiveness of his speech.
Yeah,
So
that's very true. Yes, and I like the comparison between ʿAttar and the Hudhud. I mean, I think he's very intentional in giving us that kind of a parallel. But the whole time I was listening to you, but also as I was reading your book and, in earlier stages and later stages, one thing that is really fascinating, and I don't know that anyone has addressed that, is that there is ʿAttar the teacher, the ʿAttar the Hudhud, and he's so meticulous and careful and writing everything down. And then you go to the ghazals and there is ዐطار, از ما دارم که امشب نیم مست حال کوبان کوزه دردی به دست سر به بازار قلندر برنهم پس به یک ساعت ببازم هرچه هست. Right? It's all spontaneity. It's a lot of, it's like throwing away all of these tools that he has collected so carefully. And, if one of my dreams is that either me or somebody takes, the ghazals of ʿAttar, and then just brings it up there. And again, it would be exactly the story that you said. We're not gonna solve anything, but there is just that dimension. So I was wondering if you might want to, in the very few minutes that we have left, if you might want to just talk about that aspect of ʿAttar's personality.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. And one gets a very different sense sort of reading the ghazals than one does of reading the Masnavis. And of course, I mean, of course, I mean, I don't have a good answer to this. I mean, it's a different genre, of course, or a different form, right? And different kinds of tradition. Right. One thing that I think is interesting, and as I've spent all this time saying we should sort of take the homiletic aspects more seriously, and I stand by that. But there's a reason people are interested in ʿAttar's narratives, and that's because he seems to be more interested in narratives than a lot of people who came before him. So if you look at, I did this in a book chapter I wrote, but if you look at, and this was building on work done by De Bruyne, but if you look at Senai's Hadirat, there's not that many narratives in it. And in earlier manuscripts, there's even less. And I went through and actually counted them up and counted that. It's something like 6% narrative in the earliest manuscripts. All the rest is these homiletic sections. ʿAttar, at the Conference of the Birds, I'd have to go back and see what I wrote and check the exact number, but it's over 50% narrative. It's like 52% narrative. So that's like, well, I still say the homilies are half of it. We got to take it seriously. But in terms of the tradition, like he's doing way more narrative than people before him. Something that I've always been, and then of course the frame narratives are also narrative. The reason this connects with the ghazals is I also feel, you see this in Senai too, but I also feel like there's an interesting, a lot of his ghazals have a kind of narrative element, right? Talking about the calendar.
Yes, so does Maulana's, Rumi's. You do have these narrative, which is not at all, I mean, it's not the standard practice.
Yeah, so.
And I think you should absolutely stand by the significance of didacticism and those narratives. This wasn't really my comment, was not at all.
No, I know.
Because I think I agree with you. I mean, one master poet who has seen a lot of mean reaction because of didacticism is Sa'di. Sa'di, that mu'allim akhlaq, Sa'di, people have seriously, as poet as Shamlu. I mean, I think Shamlu is a poet. That's is a master poet. He misses Sa'di because he's like so opposed to didacticism and all of that he doesn't even want to take a serious look at that. So I'm absolutely delighted that you actually do that. And I think it's interesting to see ʿAttar's various dimensions. And of course, the point that the generic differences, the generic horizons, who's reading and, all of that makes a difference. But I don't know. I just love that calendar ʿAttar that doesn't appear.
Absolutely. Yeah. absolutely.
And thank you so much, Austin John. It was really, really good. And we look forward to, I'm excited about the topic you picked for your next book. So we're looking forward to all of that.
Might take another 10 years, but
well, no, we won't let you this time. Now that we know 10 years, now we won't let you take 10 years.
Maybe you'll have to tell me. I don't know. You'll have to tell us if it's easier the second time. Or
yes,
can tell us if it's easier the second time too.
It is actually.
And it's easier and easier.
Oh, that's good.
Well, I don't know if I put two easiers next to each other, but it definitely, you for one thing, the rules of the game in many ways much more practically. But you're much more familiar with the broader body of literature and there are all kinds of.
It gets easier and easier, but life intervenes as usual. So
the joke I'm telling people now is that I feel I'm finally at a stage in my career where I could write like a really amazing dissertation proposal. I could write a great dissertation proposal now.
That's very nice.
Well, on that note, I think I'll speak for people who are here and those who will watch this video on our website to thank you very much, Austin.
Sure, my pleasure.
Have a wonderful rest of your
semester. Thank you. This was wonderful.
See you
we
very
really
soon.
enjoyed ourselves. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us, everyone.